Hey there, friends. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I'm doing yet another installment of the Freelancer Q&A series, the one that I do a lot of over the last couple of years. Once again, I am sorry for the absolute bedlam of a construction scene behind me. Life at Airbnbs is weird, and well, I'm not going to get into the specifics. It doesn't matter. I may or may not have this cleaned up. You know what? I bet I won't. I bet I won't have this cleaned up next week. It really is kind of out of my control. There is a broken bed here that I'm trying to help I mean, like, I don't sleep in the office, so like it doesn't matter to me, but I'm kind of trying to help the folks uh, deal with the broken bed, but like not enough that I really want to disrupt my day to day. So there it just kind of sits behind me. Anyway, that's boring. So on to more pressing matters like today's question, which is, how do I know if my client is treating me too much like an employee? And this time around, I do remember the context a little bit better here. That said, I'm going to generalize a bit for anybody who's watching and might be interested in this question. So the idea is you're a freelancer, you're doing some kind of contract work for a client, and maybe it's starting to feel like you're being treated too much like an employee. What is I guess, where are the boundaries, or how do you draw the line? What's appropriate? So I'm going to get into that here. I'm going to give you maybe some framework. I jotted down a couple notes for understanding this perhaps from a legal perspective. And then also like how, my personal take on when this relationship isn't really as kind of disparate as it should be or what have you. So I'll get into all of that. In this the first thing I'll say is, think about why you care. Now, there are kind of two reasons I can really imagine caring about this. One is you are doing contract work and it seems unfair to you in the sense that you think you should be an employee. That is not the case with the person who is asking this question. But if that is the case with you, this is really kind of a legal concern, and you might be being misclassified as a contractor. So this comes up a lot, and I think I did talk about this. I'll throw it up on YouTube if I think to last week, which was whether California is a good state to do business in or not. In my opinion, probably not the best, but I wouldn't move out of state to do business either. As a quick recap of that, California is regulation heavy, and I talked about kind of the pros and cons about that. Now, if this is something you're concerned about and you're in California, this is a pro for you. California is very kind of worker sided in this matter, if you will. And there are some other states that maybe as well, in terms of claiming rights for you if you are being misclassified as a contractor. So if that's the case, I'll go into an explanation here momentarily as to when you might know that you're being misclassified as a contractor. And I am not an expert in what your legal recourse on that would be, but if you feel you're being misclassified as a contractor and you don't want to be, understand that there is legal recourse, and you might want to go do some reading up on that, or ask someone about it, either in the space or like an attorney if you have one. Now, I'm going to talk about that one kind of relatively briefly here, because the question in which this context is being asked is more about, I guess, defining your autonomy as a practitioner, as an indie, rather than being kind of like reabsorbed into an organization and treated as kind of a de facto employee. So if that's the reason you care, I get that, because I think especially a lot of people that would consume my content, your goal in going off on your own is to establish a business or a practice and become increasingly independent. If what happens is you take on that first gig and you find yourself just slurped back into like de facto employment, you might be asking, why did I go off on my own again? I'm just an employee, but with fewer dental benefits now. So why did I do this? So I'll spend time talking about where I would kind of see that line being drawn as well. Now, for those of you out there that might be concerned about being misclassified as a contractor, there is, and I don't know how pervasive this is, I keep an eye on this, but there is something called the ABC test. And this is the standard that California and I believe a handful of other states apply. I do not know if the IRS applies this standard. If you're out of the US, my knowledge about this gets even shakier. But there are a few heuristics that really have to do with how you should be classified. So one of the, and I don't know why this is called ABC. Maybe there's like an acronym there that I'm not aware of, probably. But one of the determining factors there is the degree to which you control the nature of the work that you're doing. Meaning, do you have autonomy? Hey, maybe that's the like, do you have autonomy in being given a task? And do you control the timing? Like, do you determine when the tasks will be complete? Do you determine how? Do you determine the tools that you're going to use, et cetera? Or does the employer kind of determine and set that up for you? So a quick example I could give here, just because, it's easiest for me off the cuff. If I think about the way that Hit Subscribe works with authors, you could maybe argue about this either way, because we are, to some extent, having input on things like due dates, and we do ask the authors to like upload blog posts into WordPress so that we can port them over to client sites. So to some extent, you might say that we're controlling how and when. But on the flip side, I would counter with, we do not tell our authors whether they should use Markdown or Google Docs or Word or whatever when they're initially drafting. We only care where the post winds up, not where you draft it or what kind of tools you use. If you decide you want to go use some paid blog post drafting tools, God bless, we're not paying you for that. That's entirely up to you. As for dates, it's pretty customary with the work that we're doing for us to put content out to the pool of authors and then let the author say, I want to claim this post and work on it. I can have it in by, like March 20th. So we are not explicitly determining when you have to have it in. So when you look at that, that's kind of the opposite of what I'm talking about with an employer. An employer, it would be fairly typical for them to say, okay, everybody uses this tool to draft blog posts. Everybody needs to have blog posts drafted, in the morning so that they can be reviewed in the afternoon. The employer is going to exert a lot more control over processes. They're going to assume responsibility for training. They're going to be paying for your tools and so on and so forth. The employer is really creating a system of work that gets done and then plugging you as kind of a cog into that system and telling you how every last detail should go. They might even be enlisting training on your behalf. So there is obviously some continuum and spectrum there, but one big determining factor is how autonomously you are doing the work. A second one is the degree to which the work that you're doing is different than the normal course of business that the company is doing. So, consider two situations. One, you are doing application development and you go to work for, as a contractor for a company that, is like is not technical. Maybe it's a nonprofit of some kind. And they need like some website work done here and there. And you find yourself working 34 hours, 40 hours a week for them for a while. But they're just telling you things like, we need the website updated, or we need like stuff going on here or whatever. So here's this nonprofit. Nobody that works for that nonprofit knows anything about software development. They're just kind of deferring to you on how to do all this stuff, right? The nonprofit does whatever it is they do. They administer a charity or something. They don't sell software. Now, let's say on the other hand that you were going to work for an agency that was doing application development. So they were selling software development labor, and they grabbed you and employed you as a contractor who was also doing software development labor. So you, like all of their employees, are doing the thing that they sell, and you are doing similar labor to all of their full-time employees, and yet you are not a full-time employee. That is a potential misclassification situation. And then finally, the worker would typically be in the same trade as the work being contracted. So this is a different sort of thing. And actually, my last example would kind of run afoul of this. But the worker is, or sorry, no, it wouldn't. It would be a good example. I'm getting this backwards. The worker is being contracted to do something that they consider to be their trade. So if you are saying, I'm hanging out my shingle to do application development work, and you are being picked up to go do application development work, that actually squares, because your practice and the thing you're being paid to do are one and the same. Now, what they're getting at with this is, imagine that you're working for that nonprofit and you kind of run out of website stuff to do, and the nonprofit says, hey, you want to sweep the floors, and we got some clerical and data entry work we can keep you doing for a while. If they start to have you doing stuff that has nothing to do with your stated independent practice in this fashion, that can also be misclassification. And usually I think the standard is probably that you could make noise about it if it's any one of these things. But if it's all of that kind of coming together, you start to look a lot like an employee. So that's what the ABC test is. I am not an expert in this. I might be getting things slightly wrong. I just monitor this as I think about the time at which it would make sense for somebody at Hit Subscribe to not really be, they're kind of starting to walk and quack like an employee instead of a contractor. I know enough to keep an eye out for that to kind of assess, should we make this person some kind of salaried offer or is it appropriate to keep them as a contractor? And there are other litmus tests too. Like if I think about the nature of the work Hit Subscribe is doing with contractors, I didn't bring this up, but like the ABC test, I don't know if it includes this, but like we're talking about giving independent contractors, just a work that's the tiniest fraction of what they're doing. And they're also generally quite often fully employed by some other entity. So even though we may be selling content or, well, I like to think of us as selling content programs, but if we're selling content and those people are writing content, that can still, potentially be independent. So if you are thinking, oh, they're misclassifying me as an employee, there is typically going to be a certain like volume of work that you need to be doing for them that should be fairly substantial. Like nobody's going to confuse you with an employee if you're doing 2 hours a month of work for them. So there are other ways to think about that as well. Now, let's put that aside. If you do feel like you are being misclassified, go out, look up what the ABC test is, look up other ways to understand if you're being misclassified and kind of think, do I want to be an employee there? And then you could think about avenues to pursue. I wouldn't like go right out and start making like legal overtures. You might just approach the company about making you an employee as a first step. Anyway, the rest of this is going to be the flip where you don't really want to be an employee. How do you know if you're kind of getting sucked too far back into employee land? So there are going to be some similar points here, but let me just kind of think off the cuff. If I were doing a freelance practice, what would be a tell to me that I was probably too close to an employee? The first and biggest one is, do you have just one client and you are working 40-ish hours a week for that client? That's the strongest tell. You have no other prospects on the radar. You have a completely open-ended contract with this client that neither of you has any intention of deviating from for the foreseeable future, and you don't do any work for anybody else. I might argue that you are an employee at that part. Like, I don't care what the paperwork looks like, that's an employee. So that would be the biggest number one tell, is you have no other clients, no other prospects, nothing else going on but this one very large client. Let's assume that that's not true entirely. Maybe you do have a little work going on, but maybe what you're doing is like 35, 40 hours a week for this one client. And then you just have a couple other piddly little things. And the work for that client is very open-ended. There's no end date inside to your contract. That is another scenario that's maybe not quite equally bad. Like you do have a little bit else going on, but that just feels like an employee that also moonlights. So I think the biggest determiner here is, do you have zero or minimal other clients? Does one client make up like 90% of your book of business or more? And is your relationship with that client open-ended? That to me is like the biggest red flag there. And if you're in that situation, I mean, for my money, I don't know what's going on in your life, but like probably more often than not, you ought to just think about going to work for that company. Yeah, sure, your hourly will come down, but now you're not managing your own PTO and you're going to get insurance benefits and all that good stuff. Also, there's career advancement there. So if you have contractors that are on indefinitely as an employer, you don't really have any responsibility for their career development or pay increases or anything like that. So you as that contractor, sure, I guess you could negotiate a rate increase every now and then, but probably going to do better just letting the employer give you periodic merit increases and promotions. So that's a big one to me. You have 90% or more tied up indefinitely with one particular client. Another big tell would be the degree to which you're included in corporate culture. So, and this is especially true. Like I can remember an odd situation I was in once where I came on to do subcontract work that for a while was full-time, but it was like bounded in scope. And I was a subcontractor for this company. And what wound up happening was I actually W-2'd hourly, which is a strange arrangement, but it was because their client would not allow sub 1099 work. So I came on as this kind of temporary weird employee. And I remember getting like automated emails through their system about, I don't know, like I guess a performance review or like whatever career development stuff. So if stuff like that is happening to you, nobody was going to confuse me with like a salaried exempt employee there. It was just kind of a peculiarity of the system. But if that kind of thing is happening to you, if you are being included in like team building offsites, or if you are being included in career development activities, or you're being sent for like training that normally happens for corporate employees, that's probably not a great sign. It basically means that there are points at which the systems and people involved cannot distinguish you from their employees. So you're on this mailing list and, oops, we didn't realize you weren't an employee. That generally means that a lot of people there think of you in that fashion. So that's another big tell, is people in your day-to-day confusing you with an employee or finding you indistinguishable from employees. Maybe the cubicle mates you have or whatever is going on in 2023, but people are surprised to learn that you're not an actual employee. Like, oh, wait, you're a contractor? So like, how does that work? That's a pretty strong tell. Maybe a weaker tell, but still one that's interesting, is like, who's buying your tools? If you're a software developer, are you buying your own IDE? Are you keeping up with your own like tools of the trade and productivity plugins and stuff yourself? Or are you having those bought for you and chosen for you by your employer / client? If they're making those types of decisions for you, buying you tools, forcing you to use tools, that's another sign that you're not really in charge of your own destiny there. If you're doing long-term contracts at a client, what might be more common and more reasonable is if they provision you some laptop that they give to contractors so they have control over what's on that machine or whatever, and you're using that, it's reasonable enough for them to want to exert control over their ecosystem. But at the same time, you might have some freedom when you're working on your own machine to do your own thing. That can be dicey, especially in the software world in an enterprise, but it is a sign. Like, are you choosing your tooling? Are you picking out the tools of the trade that you're using? Are you responsible for your own like training and so on and so forth? Or is your client doing that? Trying to think, boundaries or lack thereof might be a little more of a gray area, because sometimes, like, if you have a healthy freelance practice, then you're the one setting boundaries with your clients. Here's when I will and won't communicate. Here's how I will and won't communicate. Here's how I invoice this, that, and the other. That said, some of those arrangements can actually be pretty employee friendly. So I remember doing subcontract work at places, or just even like being there as an indie, where they had pretty worker friendly policies in place in the enterprise, where it was like, you are not allowed to work more than 40 hours a week. So it isn't necessarily the case that the lack of respect of boundaries and overwork and all that means you're being treated like an employee. But if they are sort of generally adopting an attitude that's indistinguishable that way from their employees, so if you send an invoice to them and you say, I want net 30 or net 60 or whatever, and they say, no, we're just going to like run payroll for you at the same time as employees. I mean, you wouldn't be on their payroll, but like, if they're just kind of that's probably a bad example, but if they're looping you into processes that are like their employees and just telling you, nah, that's how we do it, it seems like they're the one controlling that situation. Invoicing is a little weird, because that's actually a better deal for employees than it is for contractors. So it wouldn't be common for someone to say, no, I'm not paying you net 30. I'm going to pay you every 2 weeks. But hopefully you kind of get the gist of what I'm saying. If you are saying, here is the way I work, and they're saying to you, no, this is the way everybody in the app dev group works, and you don't get a say in that, that would be their position towards employees. So if you're saying, I don't work on Fridays in my practice, and they're like, yeah, you do, because that's when our employees work, it's a smell that you're being treated more like an employee. Apart from the ABC type stuff and the misclassification, I don't know if I can think of too many other things. And I will also say, number one, philosophically, if you're asking this question, you're probably too much like an employee, because if you have a practice And that practice has, like, I can't see somebody with like 3 or 4 different clients at the same time where you're, doing variable amounts of work each week. I can't see anyone who has that going on asking that question. Likewise, if you have a practice where you engage with clients for 2 to 4 weeks at a time and then you move on, I can't see anyone who does that asking this question. I can't see anyone with a diversified book of business asking this question. I can't see anybody who doesn't have the same basic arrangement as the employees in a group asking this question. I can't see somebody without an open-ended relationship asking this question. So what I'm getting at the core is what I'm saying there. If you're asking this question, yeah, you're probably quacking like an employee more than you wish you were, and more than you should be. I've talked about this so many times I can't even link to a video. But you need to diversify, have fewer engagements that are shorter or thinner or something. You should make it a goal, if you're asking this question, to get in the next year or two into a situation where no one client accounts for any more than 20% of your revenue in a given year. And if you get into that situation where no one client is accounting for more than 20% of your revenue, I promise you, you will not be asking me a question like this. So it is just smart business. If you intend to have a freelance practice or to build an equity business, you should be in a situation where this is irrelevant to you, where you wouldn't think to answer this question. So if you're asking this, it means you have work to do towards diversifying your book of business, and I would definitely recommend that you go do that. On the flip side, circling all the way back, if you want a tighter relationship with that company, you're potentially misclassified as a contractor. So I would, start talking to them about employment, or, I guess if it occurs to you and you want to go adversarial, you could see what sort of recourse you have. And I don't actually know what sort of recourse misclassified contractors would have. I guess maybe back benefit compensation of some kind. So I'm not really clear on that. I think the employers would get, fined or something, but I don't know what recourse you would have. But, I would definitely go the friendly route and say like, hey, we're doing a lot of work together. Do you have any salaried type roles? And see what they say. So hopefully all of that helps and makes sense. And I will catch you all next time.